Hi, thank you for the great papers. And since this is the last session of the whole conference, I'll try to keep it short. So the two papers in this session were survey papers. So for those papers, I'll just be mostly focusing on mostly comments rather than discussions on the numerical strategy. And then the third paper, I'll talk more about some questions on the analysis. So the first paper from reading from this paper, I learned a lot because fintech, although we hear a lot about it these days, it's very difficult to know the details about what exactly fintech are, how we define them, and how the trends in these fintechs have evolved, especially across different sectors. So just to briefly summarize what we've been learning from this paper is to assess the welfare implications of fintech and assess in particular whether capital raising platforms are suited to perform the credit risk management function. So I think the important part of this, the important contribution of this paper is that given the surge in the financial transactions covered by fintech, it's very important at this point to estimate what are the pros and cons and what we need to be worried about and what are the policies that we need to design in order to have these fintech actually improve the welfare. So the key findings are that first, the fintech service, by increasing the options of the consumers, have greatly enhanced both the efficiency of financial intermediation and the extent of financial inclusion. So the form of fintech varies widely across countries, particularly in developing countries, probably because of the available technology that can be used as a platform for fintech. And so in developing countries in particular, fintech allows services to many consumers who were traditionally underserved and only informal financial intermediation was available to. And then it reduces the credit gap due to information asymmetry using soft data, right? However, the downside of this rapid introduction of fintech is that it also introduces new problems. So it led some platform-based borrowers to be, in the short run, they are free of debt because they can borrow credit. However, in the long run, because they found out how easy it is to get credit through the crowdfunding or P2P platforms, they tend to be in further debt in the long run. And also it can work as a destabilizer in the financial market with a pronounced credit cycle. Okay, so these are what has been summarized in the paper. So I had the whole draft instead of the PPT, so there might be a little bit more information that I cover in this discussion rather than just the presentation. Okay, so obviously, the conclusion is we need new regulations that are more appropriate to ensure the credit loss share by fintech services providers are necessary. And then basically, I think some of the questions that I wanted to raise while reading this paper, I guess this would be the focus of my discussion, is that Professor Cho has discussed a lot about whether these fintech service firms are suitable for instituting a full-blown risk-based pricing. Okay, so it seems that this problem is most severe in the P2P and crowdfunding sector rather than other types of fintech. And so I guess my question is, apart from just increasing the regulation, are there anything that can be done at the private sector level, or maybe that can be other directions for policy to induce the fintech services to better share the associated risk and set adequate prices for credit? That's my first question. And my second question is that it is true that fintech has increased financial inclusion and extend financial services to traditionally unserved population who are probably maybe more with low credit rating, or maybe they're more rural or more remote if they're in the developing countries, or maybe lower income. So I guess my question is, it's true that it increases the financial inclusion, but could it be that it had the side effect of actually increasing the inequality even within the low income or the underdeserved population, so that the poverty issue stemming from credit constraint is more aggravated as fintech develops? That's my second question. So because this paper, if you read the whole draft, it's really interesting. I think you should all take a look at it. It's very extensive. It covers a lot of the issues there. So I think my question is limited to these two because a lot of the issues are already addressed in the paper. Okay. So the second paper was really interesting because I think as the author also, Professor Lacouvene also mentions that previous works on productivity dispersions have mostly focused on technology or inputs as factors that affect productivity. Okay. However, this paper focuses on the role of incentives or management or organization practices on affecting the productivity. And so some of the key and interesting findings that I personally thought from the paper were that variations in managerial practices can explain up to about 35% of income gap variations between countries. And in particular, it matters also for microfirms in developing countries. Okay. And I think this is a topic that was also dealt in the previous session, that perceived managerial ability is actually very different from objective manager ability. And in general, the managers were overconfident that they had good managerial skills. Okay. And then finally, the management can be improved through consultations. And what is important is that this positive impact on performance persists long after the consulting practice has been done. Okay, so in the paper, I think he finds 8 years of persistence. Okay, so these are some of the questions that I would like to ask. So it seems that understanding the dynamics of managerial practice would also be important. So if some firm has poor managerial practice, if there's no intervention, is there room for improvement eventually? Or does it always end up being bad? I think it would be one question. And especially if we want to identify the causal effect of managerial practice on for performance, I think we need a longitudinal variation in managerial skills. I think so that's one important data set that should be, I guess, more developed. Okay, and I think the second question is there any work on how much difference in productivity is explained by the innate nature of the manager, like how smart the manager is, how hardworking the manager is, these non-cognitive abilities of the manager, versus the measurable managerial practices, like whether they do incentive pay, whether they do some sort of other types of ranking systems, whatnot. So I guess the former is very difficult to change, right? Because it's an innate, unobservable ability, and then the latter would be it can be changed as a result of policy. So I guess my question is, which one is more important, or is there any research that talks about this? And then third, so I have some questions about these survey questions on managerial practices. So depending on which manager you ask, right, whether it's the most high-ranking manager or someone who's a middle-level manager, I guess these people can answer differently to the same question of managerial practices. So I think it would be important to come up with methods to reduce bias from like which kind of manager answers the question. And I guess for developing countries, not only small manufacturing firms, but like one-person self-employment enterprises are very common in developing countries, right? So I think my question is whether these managerial practices can also say something about the productivity of a one-person firm, and whether eventually, if they are given good managerial practices or if they're trained to have better organizational skills, can they scale up to be a micro-enterprise? Okay. So because I think one of the slides said that managerial skills are positively correlated with innovation. I think that understanding that link better can help us understand how self-employed one-person firm can jump to be a bigger sized enterprise. Okay. And then on the final paper on branchless banking agents in Indonesia. So the paper basically estimates the effect of financial incentives on take-up and usage of new technology. In this case, the like mobile banking, using individual level administrative data. And the contribution of this paper is that relative to previous works, it identifies the effect of higher incentives on demand and supply of new technologies separately. And it shows that not actually the objective quality of the banking product itself, but the perceived quality of the product is an important factor for take-up and usage. Okay, so I think that's a new finding. So what the authors find is that higher commissions induce increases in take-up, but only when agents' compensation is private. Okay, and the demand side effect is of the same size as the supply side effect. So if you mix these effects together, you might not see any results on the take-up. Okay, so this tells us how important it is to disentangle between supply side effects and then demand side effects. Okay. So some of my questions is that, so I think if the high incentive public information agents change their form of effort, so they have so not only they have lower levels of, or similar levels of effort, but what if the way of promoting the banking product is different? If they know that the clients know about their commission system, I think if there is this change in behavior, it might bias the results. So I think it's important to show that the high incentive public type agents do not change their form of effort. And although we couldn't see it very well from the slides because the statistics were very small. So when I saw the presentation, I think the summaries, the authors have information on how much the villagers trust in agents. So the trust level, if I remember correctly, was really low at the baseline already. And about, I think 57% of the villagers already knew who the agents were. Okay, and so I think since trust in agent is collected, I would expect that the effect of public high incentive coefficient would be different if it's applied to a low trust village and then with a high trust village, right? You would see that the trust in agents would go down even further in villages where they had initially low levels of trust. So I think it would be interesting if the authors can show that to substantiate their argument that this high incentive and public information is indeed driving down the trust in the banking product. And I think the paper said 1/3 of the villages already had an existing agent, and then 2/3 of the villages, they had to recruit a new agent. So I think there could be differences across villages with an existing agent and where they had to recruit a new one. I think that could also tell us more about how this trust plays in changing the perceived quality of the banking product. Okay, and so this paper is basically saying that in order to promote new technology, we need to increase the effort level of the agents through increasing commission, but this can only work when the information is private, right? So I would imagine that in most settings, the commission would be private, right? You don't really disclose the commission level of the agents. So I think what we learn from this is very important in this context. But if we think about adoption of new technology in general, how can we apply this finding to be more informative about how we want to design other policies that to increase take-up? Because I think, I think most policies would would not disclose the commission anyway, right? So I think, as a final note, I think it would be interesting to see as future work what kind of product quality the clients are most responsive to. So in this paper, the authors are assuming that the clients are very responsive to the level of trust in the agents, right? Because as Professor Cho said, these agents are basically human ATMs, right? So you really need to believe in these agents to take these new banking products. But then maybe the demand is more responsive to the level of fees the ATM withdrawal fees, or maybe these demand is more responsive to the level of interest rate that is provided by the bank, right? So I think it's important as future work to understand what quality dimension affects the demand the most, and that will tell us more information, be more informative of how clients take up these new banking technology. So I think that's the end of my discussion. So I just threw in a lot of questions. So these are very new work actually outside of my field. So some of them might be not very helpful comments, but so please take my comments again.